the work that I am presenting today is delivered jointly on behalf of the World Heritage Leadership Program, of which the contents were developed in collaboration with IUCN, ECROM, and the UNESCO World Heritage Center. So it is not just of ECROM's work that has gone into here, although we have been the main sort of driving engine to push towards an integrated guidance. And I should also mention that all of the colleagues who have participated in drafting this new impact assessment guidance that is forthcoming are all part of this seminar, namely Mr. Richard Mackay for ECOMOS and Ms. Sarah Court for ECROM, although we're missing our IUCN expert, Ms. Mizuki Murai, and also Mr. Feng Jing from UNESCO World Heritage Center. And also Mr. Ascanio D'Andrea is also another expert who has participated in the drafting process of this guidance document. So I would just like to head off from the start that this is the collaborative work of many, and that I am very sure that all the content that will be delivered over the next few days are very much in sync with what I am to present today. So very briefly, in a nutshell, I just wanted to talk to you about what ECROM is and what kind of role we play for the World Heritage Convention. As I mentioned, we are mainly focused on capacity building, and the World Heritage Leadership Program is one of the main programs that delivers a lot of capacity building activities to states parties. And it's jointly delivered between IUCN and ECROM, but in collaboration with ECOMOS and the UNESCO World Heritage Center. And the program is generously funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment, with additional activity funding also coming from Switzerland and the Republic of Korea. So the program itself, the leadership program, covers a very wide range of themes to promote holistic management of World Heritage sites. We operate under the thematic modules of effective management, resilience, and impact assessment. But all of these thematic areas are working towards to promote nature-culture linkages and people-centered approaches into heritage practice. So overall, the main approach behind all of our work towards management, whether it be regarding disaster risk or climate change adaptation or conducting impact assessment, is to really reinforce the idea to adopt a heritage place approach, which you can sort of see in the picture being shared on the slide here, because our heritage places are not just a limited spot on a map with walls around it. It's actually a place where a lot of people and a lot of species and natural organisms all come together and live together. And we also need to emphasize the need to look beyond the designated heritage and look at the different and diverse relationships that the heritage place has with its surroundings. For instance, if we have a cultural site, and for this purpose, I highlight this occasion of perhaps a hypothetical cultural site in the middle of an urban city, we might have a very small designated area for the heritage boundary itself. However, this will be accompanied by a buffer zone, which is, you can see it colored in blue around the area, which would provide the immediate setting and immediate type of protection cushion for the heritage itself. But then we also need to understand that the wider setting and the area of influence for the heritage site itself is actually much larger than just the heritage property and the buffer zone itself, because of the different actions that happen in the background that can all impact on the outstanding universal value of the heritage. And I know that the wider setting can be a little bit of a tricky concept because of the diverse range of types of heritage that we have within the World Heritage List. And for this to identify what would be the appropriate understanding of wider setting, we always need to go back into understanding what the outstanding universal value for that particular heritage is, and try to understand the various different relationships, the people and the actions that can be related to that value. So as I mentioned, one of the key areas that the program is working is that to update the existing ECOMOS and IUCN guidance on conducting impact assessment for World Heritage, which Feng has already mentioned in his previous presentation. And very much we would like to promote this idea of adopting this heritage place approach within this new guidance. Hopefully within a few weeks it will be released. This presentation will deliver the content of this upcoming guidance. That is the collaborative work of all the organizations you see cited on this slide. So the requests for impact assessment by the World Heritage Committee over the past 10 years has increased exponentially. And more than 200 sites around the world have been requested by the World Heritage Committee to conduct either an environmental impact assessment or a heritage impact assessment for the protection and management of their site. This is almost going up to almost a quarter of the World Heritage list. Therefore, and we know that the methodology of conducting an impact assessment is not necessarily new, but the specifics of how to apply it to World Heritage and how we could actually use it effectively for heritage management is now going under a lot of development and evolvement in the past few years. In order to conduct an effective impact assessment, perhaps the most important step is to understand the diverse types of factors that can affect and that could affect in the future the property and its management status. Now, this is a list of factors that is provided in the World Heritage Center website. And whilst you can see that there is the subtitle of threats, we also do acknowledge that a same factor can be both positive and negative. For instance, tourism in many cases can also be positive and have negative impacts on the conservation and management of heritage, whilst also, road access in different circumstances, sometimes it can actually be better for the heritage, whilst in some cases it can actually be very detrimental to the management of the heritage. So through the next few slides, I will go through just a few factors that could trigger an impact assessment. No doubt, one of the first cases that come to mind are many types of buildings and new development that can happen both within the property, within the buffer zone, but also it can happen in the setting of the property as well. And here you see photographs that are taken from the Historic Center of Vienna or the Tower of London World Heritage Property, or Villa Adriana in Tivoli, which I think will also be presented during a presentation later on in the week by Sarah Quartz, where the development was happening in the buffer zone rather than in the property itself. And all of these instances require an impact assessment to be conducted so that in response to the outstanding universal value of the heritage site in question. And we also have to recognize that there are various transportation infrastructure, such as roads, expressways, railways, or even ports that need to be assessed, as they can directly impact the integrity of the site, but they can also trigger many indirect impacts with changes of modalities for accessibility provided to the site itself, and which could increase or decrease the number of people who are able to approach and reach the site in question. We also have to be mindful that these types of transportation or connecting projects can be developed on a much larger regional consideration. And for this, I also take the LAPSET project as an example, where the transport corridor project from South Sudan and Ethiopia across Kenya, so across 3 different countries, can eventually trigger an impact assessment that on a site that happens to be situated at the very end of the transportation corridor that is in question. So all the aspects of connectivity that can be triggered by such development also need to be very well considered. And services infrastructure, notably nowadays, increasingly we have new renewable energy facilities being proposed. We have dams and hydropower facilities that again require a lot of careful consideration, especially since whatever interventions in the case of rivers and hydropower facilities, whatever interventions that are made on a river will eventually affect any areas that are downstream of the intervention. So even though you may be situated in a very, very long distance away from the said proposal, if it's a project that has a very strong connection to the immediate environment of your own site, then this project will need to go through a consideration of a heritage impact assessment. We also need to be aware of the factors of pollution that can be caused by such projects. And these may affect the site in various different instances of the project itself, especially also during construction when a lot of debris may be produced from the construction of the project, but also within the changes of how these wastes are produced and collected or accumulated during the course of construction, but also operation of the project itself. And we can think about solid waste, sewage, litter, visitor management, etc., but also different types of agricultural runoff or industrial operations that can cause air, water, and overall environmental pollution. There are also instances of physical resource extraction where by mining and oil and gas works, quarrying and water extraction works are absolutely forbidden and prohibited within World Heritage property areas and in the buffer zone, but that it also needs to be carefully considered for those projects that could possibly happen in the vicinity of World Heritage sites for fear of what could impact on the World Heritage sites' values. And whilst we cannot necessarily prevent sudden ecological or geological events or drastic climatic events, these are also very important to consider as factors when assessing the viability of a proposed project, because it could also provide us with very important information about what kind of areas should be avoided or what kind of mitigation measures we also need to take into account when designing different projects. And no doubt we all need to be very aware of all the cumulative impacts of any development. And whilst an opening of a seaport on its own could maybe have very little direct impact to a site itself, the indirect impacts caused by the operation of the port can have detrimental impacts, such as with the influx of tourists and visitors overflowing the site itself, that can have detrimental impacts on the heritage. And again, factors such as civil unrest, deliberate destruction, and terrorism and war can also be present as factors affecting the property, of which we cannot directly always control the development of events, but at the same time, such factors need to be considered openly and also considerately within impact assessment processes. However, perhaps one of the most important and one of the last factors that I will go through for management challenges lies in our own governance systems for managing sites. Many times, there are issues regarding decision-making processes where certain decisions could be taken without consulting all the necessary stakeholders or rights holders, nor involving all the responsible institutions. Therefore, the identification of all the necessary legal and customary frameworks that can be activated in order to consider and review a project proposal is very important, and which is one of the reasons why I thought the earlier presentations on outlining the legal system of Malaysia was also very, very informative. And within these legal and customary frameworks, we need to ensure the appropriate and timely participation of the necessary stakeholders and rights holders. Now, I've gone through a number of different factors and noting that these are not necessarily all resolvable by simply conducting an impact assessment. Rather, an impact assessment is the means to get to a conclusion that we need to adopt a better mechanism of managing such factors, or we need to be better at managing different disaster risks. So it needs to have an integrated approach through employing the different approaches that are available out there, which could be conducting an immediate impact assessment, but also having an approach to disaster risk management that can also be then, in the long term, be reflected into the day-to-day management actions of the site itself. Therefore, it's important to note that impact assessment is a part of management, and it's one of the many methodologies that can assist in good management of the site. And it should not be a means, it should not be an end on its own. You know, we've conducted an impact assessment, so everything is solved. It's not like that. It's more like giving us different options for which we can then move forward with conducting different management actions. And I just wanted to dwell a little bit upon the links between disaster risk management and impact assessment, which come out very strongly. By understanding that a proposed development could drastically increase the vulnerability or decrease the vulnerability of a climate change event or climate change impact or a disaster event, it can also provide a very big and important variable in conducting sound impact assessments. And I will provide an example. And this is a photograph taken in 2006 on the Yala Safari on the northwest Sri Lankan coast. And this resort, this new resort had cleared most of the sand dunes and natural vegetation for a sea view for its guests. However, there was a tsunami that hit the coastline of the northwest Sri Lankan coast in 2004, where the tsunami wave height measured about 7 meters, and it resulted in having 27 people dying of the event. And the estimated cost of the loss of this hotel was that the property damage amounted to about $1.4 million US. The hotel was closed for 2 years. Staff was cut down by 60%. Reduction of turnover was more than 50%. And the estimated loss to the local economy was about $800,000 US per year, which were the amount of money that was used for purchasing the goods and services from the local communities. Now, however, this is a photograph taken a few kilometers up the same coastline in Yala National Park. And you'll see here a small round circle that sort of shows the roof of a different resort, which is an eco resort that did not clear the coast for an ocean view, but it actually integrated the resort within the natural surroundings and made it almost inconspicuous when the photo was being taken. However, for this particular site, with the same tsunami happening, because it was actually protected by the sand dunes and the vegetation, the natural vegetation in front of it, this hotel did not experience any damage nor deaths. And the tsunami wave that actually affected this resort was only 5 centimeters in height. Therefore, researchers and scientists who have studied the area assert that it was the sand dunes and coastal vegetation that protected the site. And this gives us an important viewpoint into understanding how different factors can be combined to understand how big an impact would be caused in the situation of unexpected disaster events. But I also wanted to take a little bit of time to say that not all is bad for heritage sites, and we do also emit a lot of good. And it's not just the factors that we need to understand and the threats of it, but actually the relationship of the site to its various functions and to its various audiences. And there's the aspect of services and benefits that the heritage is already providing and can provide to its associated people and communities, that we very often overlook these relationships as a given situation. But we really need to understand what kind of benefits that the people are already drawing out from these places, so that whatever proposal comes up, we do not forego considering these existing livelihoods or benefits that the heritage site is already providing for the communities, and that the management objectives and action also take into account these aspects. And these benefits are not just applicable to natural sites and the environment, but from the existence and the use of cultural sites in relation to its benefits to society, health, and well-being, but also to the economy and education itself. So, working off on these various different factors and how they can be combined in order to be used for impact assessment, we will now jump into the actual nitty-gritty details about impact assessment. Now, there are broadly two types of impact assessments that can be conducted. One is the strategic environmental assessment. And this is the type of assessment that reviews plans, policies, and programs. And therefore, it needs to happen at a much earlier stage and at a broader level. And usually these SEAs are taken up by the public administration, by the government, when they are establishing large-scale regional plans that would then inform how individual projects would actually happen on the ground. So it prepares for different projects. Whereas we have the EIA, the Environmental and Social Impact Assessment, or the Heritage Impact Assessment, that happens, that are triggered when we actually have a project proposal that is presented already with the specific plans and locations, where it's more responsive to these plans, and it's an assessment of a formalized proposal. So it's more reactive, and usually the costs of which are undertaken by the proponent of the proposed action. Now, World Heritage can be included as a component within the ESIA, or it can actually trigger a separate HIA, Heritage Impact Assessment, depending on the type of project that is being proposed. However, it's also important that World Heritage is well considered in the strategic environmental assessment and in the planning processes of larger plans and programs, so that it will not be the recipient of unexpected different proposals coming in because of a national project that was already conceived about 2-3 years ago or 5 years ago. Now, however, we also need to understand that depending on the size and scale of the project itself, a certain development might not trigger an EIA, an ESIA, depending if it's a large-scale project, whereas usually such projects would have to necessarily go through an environmental and social impact assessment process. Sometimes the projects proposed can be much smaller in size and scope, but at the same time very much affecting the site, that in these cases, we very much encourage the use of the heritage impact assessment process. Because whatever the scale and content of the change proposed is, there needs to be a moment where you can assess the impacts before the project actually takes place. So the HIA, ESIA are not mutually exclusive, but they can be used whenever it's deemed feasible to use either methods. And the process in a nutshell looks like this. The process suggested here aims to be applicable to both having a World Heritage be a component of a larger environmental impact assessment, as well as when an impact assessment is being conducted solely for the purposes of the heritage site itself to meet the World Heritage requirements. And in this diagram, whilst all my other colleagues will be going through all the individual steps in more detail, I just wanted to point out that it's not necessarily a single entity that will take up the responsibility of executing all the different steps. In fact, if you are, those of you who are in the audience, if you are from either the national or regional or municipal governments, your role will most likely be concentrated at the beginning part and at the end part, where you would be commissioning out an impact assessment to be conducted, and then you are receiving a completed impact assessment report, which you would then need to review and make decisions upon it and actually implement the follow-up actions. However, whilst being said that it's the front end and the back end, this is actually all a very important step. These are the most important junctures in a way that would dictate the quality of how the impact assessment is executed. And also, it would very much depend on your role to know what kind of decision will be taken upon conducting the impact assessment here in the middle. But before we go into all the different steps, I would just like to highlight on two different aspects that we have put on the top here as an overarching approach that needs to be considered throughout the impact assessment process. One of them is the aspect of participation, and the other one is about proactive problem solving. Now, it's important to have all related stakeholders be a part of the impact assessment in various different ways at different timings of the process as well. Not only is it important to have specialists regarding that know the details of the heritage values, but it's also those that are participating in the management and also those that know the essence of what kind of project is being proposed. So if it's a railway, we need railway engineers. We need, if it's a development in an urban area, perhaps a traffic flow specialist would also be needed. If it's a port development, we need marine engineers to know the exact scope and possible options that we can take in order to conduct the impact assessment. And there are no set answers for what is the best way to engage communities into the different aspects of impact assessment. There will be mechanisms to share more information to a wider range of people, and there are other methodologies which actually ensure more of their participation and their actions. However, it's important that these diverse types of engagements and participations can be solicited throughout the course of the assessment at different junctures. And as we get more concrete about the diverse different factors and benefits in and around the heritage place, it's important for us to then understand what kind of actors need to be consulted and need to be engaged in the entire process. Adopting a people-centered approach is definitely not a romantic idea, and we're very much aware that community members can be both good and bad influence to heritage places, and that at many times there will be conflicting viewpoints and priorities. Therefore, as heritage site managers, we need to be able to conduct a sound analysis of the different actors specifically for this project and specifically for this occasion of conducting an impact assessment, both individual and institutional, who either have the power or interest to affect the site itself. And understanding the actors and understanding their relationships with the heritage place will inform you to take more appropriate actions in respect to their respective roles and contributions to the site. Now, the other overarching approach was proactive problem solving. And this I would like to turn over to the whole option of alternatives and mitigation. Now, it's easy to think that once you've conducted an impact assessment, that there will either be a yes or no situation, which is hardly the case. We want to really promote the idea that conducting an impact assessment is more like a design process, a planning process, where the earlier you conduct it, you have many more alternatives to take. And there can be different alternatives that lead you to much better solutions, rather than always having a black and white yes or no to this project proposal. There can be many different ways that you can tailor the project proposal so that you can avoid or minimize the negative impacts. And at times you'll be able to also enhance some of the positive impacts as well. But please note that the enhancement here that we are talking about is about enhancing the project itself, the project proposed, not necessarily enhancing or changing the OUV of the site. Now, by having this range of different alternatives and different options to take, impact assessment methodology can actually be used as a tool that can help you achieve sustainable development goals, because it doesn't necessarily ask you to choose one or the other. It's more of finding the magic solution that actually satisfies all the needs of the biosphere, the society, the economy, and also the heritage agenda that would penetrate throughout all the different goals that we have. And we have to stop thinking in that set frame where it's either development or heritage protection, and considering it as a balancing act. We would rather like to promote the idea that heritage protection and sustainable development can go hand in hand as our mutual ultimate goal. Therefore, impact assessment methodologies is just a way to frame the thinking before you act, and it's providing you a structured way of going through that thinking process. And I would just like to highlight that the ability to influence the project design is much, much higher the earlier the impact assessment process is activated, and that recommendations coming out from the report of the impact assessment process should then inform any kind of decisions that will then lead on to construction. Therefore, it is imperative that the impact assessment happens before any changes are made, and that construction works or any kind of start of the project should not be made before the impact assessment actually comes out with its recommendations. And it's important to highlight that all the different proposals that could potentially affect World Heritage needs to base their assessment on the outstanding universal value and other heritage values. And this is a example of the statement of outstanding universal value on the island of Galle in Sri Lanka, which I think will also be presented in later days of the seminar. And it shows that it has to be based on a very comprehensive understanding of what is included in the statement of OUV and the attributes that are listed and included within the OUV. And that the impact assessment processes should not finish as an impact assessment alone, but then should eventually, subsequently also inform future management planning and future management actions and monitoring. So it actually creates a baseline of our management actions and be able to reflect the different findings of the impact assessment into the other aspects of management. The impact assessment should not consider a single project in isolation, nor a single type of impact, but it needs to evaluate whether the project is part of a broader trend, or if there are any cumulative impacts that needs to be taken into consideration. And here I repeat the slides of Venice, where the impact of the tourists caused by the port that can actually receive huge cruise ships is very much indirectly and cumulatively affecting the heritage site of Venice. The other important aspect to note is that there are two geographical areas that need to be considered. One is, of course, the geographical area of the World Heritage Site itself with its buffer zone and wider setting, but it's also the second more important part is to consider the project itself, the area of the project, which is represented by the red dot here, but then also the area of influence of the project itself. Like as in the example that I showed you, or with the port development of Venice, let's say, the port may be contained in a smaller area of the city of Venice, but the area of influence of the port actually very much affects all of the World Heritage Site and its buffer zone and wider setting. Therefore, the area of influence of the project and the area of the World Heritage Site and its wider setting needs to be considered in a holistic way. Oops, sorry. And then an impact assessment needs to consider the range of relevant different options and alternatives that we can take, including the option to not proceed with the project. At first and foremost, the question to ask is this project necessary? Or can the need or demand be met without the proposed action? And once this is satisfied, then it should go on to consider, then how should it be done? Are there different ways to do it or different methods to actually satisfy that need? Or where should it go? And this would very much also indicate our different options of location and finding the most appropriate place for the proposed action. And then, of course, going into the more detailed aspects about when and in what form that the project should take place. Impact assessments need to be carried out as an iterative process and not a linear one. And that it means that if there is another alternative to consider, then the other alternative also then needs to go through another round of assessment. So for instance, in this slide, you see a proposed port development for the island of Gaul. And whilst this was the initial proposal, the impact assessment process also assessed the potential impacts of a revised proposal that was proposed later on in the process of developing the project. Now, it's also important to note that there is also a temporal scale. So it's not just about the geographical areas, but it's also about, you know, how long this is going to take, how long this project is going to live. And it's not just in the construction period, but it's also in the operation period of the project and the decommissioning and possible recovery stage of the project itself. And the decommissioning and recovery I specifically mentioned for the benefit of different renewable energy projects, which can also rely heavily on the part of decommissioning, of taking down wind farms after a certain amount of time. Now we need to think about what the time frame for the entire project life cycle is, and whether the potential impacts would be contained within the project life cycle, or it would actually remain even after the project is finished. And of course, knowing that this is an unpredictable estimation of the future, we always need to use the most conservative and precautionary time frame between the two. And that, again, as we go back to the geographical areas, we need to think about what are the areas that will be directly affected by such a construction and what kind of attributes are within the project area. And that we need to consider the distance an effect can travel and also the impacts that the attributes may be exposed to within this range. So these are some of the some prompt questions that can actually lead you to conduct a sound impact assessment, especially at the stage of construction, thinking about the various different elements of what construction will bring about, It's not just a big chunk of work, but it can be divided up into specific phases and actions themselves within the construction phase. And we no doubt have to take into account that there will be extra disturbances created during the construction phase. There will be new access routes needing to be created. There will be new people coming in and new power lines and lots of waste being produced from construction stages that all need to be considered. And that during operation of such a facility or a development, we also need to consider the wider impacts of the operation of such facilities. If it's a hotel resort, it won't just be contained to the hotel area, the resort area. The operation of the hotel is actually going to impact a much wider area beyond the boundaries of the project itself. And these all need to be considered. So therefore, with all of these different questions being asked at a precise moment before any changes are actually made, and having gone through the structured way of thinking of what kind of impacts will be afflicting the attributes and the values of the heritage, will then be able to lead us into making integrated and comprehensive decisions about what is controllable and what is manageable within the World Heritage Site itself. Now, a lot of these various steps will require to have a much better and in-depth understanding of the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value, where it will be necessary to break down the heritage values and be able to nail down and really concretely list up all the different components of attributes that are included within the site that is needed to convey the value itself. So this shows an example where the colored text actually indicates the different values that are embedded within the heritage site itself. But then the underlined parts of the text shows the different attributes. These are the different components of the heritage site itself, which we really need to conduct our management actions upon. So these are the definitive objects of our protection, and the colored parts show us why these parts are important and why we should be protecting them. And once we have a much better understanding of the outstanding universal value and the following attributes that are contained within the values, we can then also go through a process of trying to list them up and making it more of a sort of a hard data source, so that we can then use it to identify where and exactly how the heritage site will be impacted. For a very long time, the heritage sector has been very much on the defensive side and saying that such developments cannot happen because it is detrimental to the heritage, but we've never really been able to explain why it is detrimental or to what aspects of the heritage site it will give us a detrimental impact. Therefore, this process that we're trying to promote through the new guidance is to really give us that structured approach into identifying which parts will be impacted specifically within the heritage site itself, so that we will be able to then be able to cross-reference all the different attributes of the site against the elements of a proposed action that has the potential to cause an impact. And by going through this sort of exercise of understanding which kind of factors would impact what type of attributes, we are then able to look into those specific areas that are identified to have an impact. And then for each and every one of them, we would then be able to understand more in depth about the quality of the change and the quality of the impact itself. And again, here I have to mention once more that it is an always case-by-case consideration of potential impacts on the outstanding universal value, because all sites have different values that are embedded in them. But here we have a series of different questions that you could ask regarding how to evaluate and understand the type of impact. We need to understand what type of change, how big is that change? Is that change either positive or negative or half and half or neutral? Over what area the impact will take place and how long it will last? What is the frequency that is foreseen that this impact